My own sister, in front of my 8-year-old son, looked at me and said, "A mother doesn't belong on a battlefield. Now it seems you've brought the battlefield home." She tried to use my 20 years of army service against me to take my child. She thought I was broken. But she was about to learn that a major in psychological warfare always has a battle plan. My name is Trudy Marks. The low thrum of the Washington State Ferry vibrated through the soles of my boots, a familiar hum that usually felt like coming home. But not today. Today it was the sound of a transport moving into hostile territory. Beside me, my 8-year-old son, Leo, pressed his face against the cold glass, his breath fogging a small circle as he watched the Seattle skyline recede into the signature gray mist of the Puget Sound. He was excited. He was going to see his cousins. I, on the other hand, felt the coiled tension of a soldier walking into a pre-planned ambush. The ferry docked, and we drove off into Medina, a world away from the quiet, pine-scented air of my home on Bainbridge Island. My sister Celeste's house wasn't a home. It was a statement piece, a monument to wealth and emptiness carved out of glass and steel on the shores of Lake Washington. It was perfect in the way a magazine spread is perfect. Sterile, untouchable, and soulless. Celeste greeted us at the door with a stiff-armed embrace, her hug feeling more like a pat-down, as an overpowering cloud of a Chanel perfume I couldn't name enveloped me. "Trudy! Leo! You made it," she chirped, her smile a little too wide, a little too bright. My brother-in-law, Leland, a corporate attorney with eyes like a shark, merely grunted a greeting from behind the shield of his Wall Street Journal. He didn't even lower the paper. Leo, oblivious to the undercurrents, happily darted off to find his cousins. I was left standing in the cavernous foyer, feeling like a specimen under a microscope. I could already sense it. This wasn't a family lunch. This was an evaluation. The stage was set, and the main course was served on porcelain dinnerware that I knew, for a fact, cost more than my first car. This lavish display wasn't hospitality. It was a demonstration of power, a reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. Celeste began with a flurry of meaningless small talk, her eyes scanning me, searching for cracks in my composure. The main course was cedar plank salmon, a local delicacy. As she served me a piece, she remarked with that honey-laced voice of hers, "This must be a nice change from the MREs you're used to, dear." The comment hung in the air, a casual dismissal of my 20-year career. I just smiled faintly, the way you do when you've identified the enemy's initial probing attack. Then she made her move. "Trudy," she said, her voice dropping to a tone of feigned, serious concern. I'm really worried about Leo. He needs stability, a normal environment." She paused for dramatic effect, her perfectly manicured hands folded on the table. She looked me straight in the eye, and the warmth vanished completely, replaced by cold, hard steel. "A mother doesn't belong on a battlefield, Trudy. And now, it seems you've brought the battlefield home with you." The air was sucked out of the room. The casual clinking of silverware from the kids' table in the other room seemed a world away. It was a direct hit, a precision strike aimed at the very core of my identity. I saw Leland lower his newspaper just enough for me to see the ghost of a smirk on his lips. This was it. The ambush. A perfectly coordinated psychological operation designed to destabilize and dismantle me. My training kicked in. 20 years in the Army, analyzing threats and controlling chaotic situations, took over. The initial shock, the hot flash of pain and anger that threatened to consume me, was instantly contained. The world narrowed. The ringing in my ears subsided. This wasn't my sister talking. This was a hostile actor executing a pre-planned script. I didn't look at Celeste. My gaze shifted and locked onto Leland. He was the architect. She was just the delivery system. My hands, which had been trembling slightly, were now perfectly still. I placed my fork and knife down on the plate, parallel to each other, without making a sound. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't give them the satisfaction of the emotional breakdown they were so clearly trying to provoke. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate breath. My voice, when I finally spoke, was even, measured, and devoid of the storm raging inside me. "Leo, honey," I called, my tone so terrifyingly normal it made Celeste flinch. "Get your coat. We need to catch the next ferry." My calm, decisive action threw her. It wasn't in her script. She had expected tears, shouting, a scene. She got a tactical withdrawal instead. "But we haven't had dessert," she stammered, her perfect composure cracking for just a second. I didn't answer. I stood, walked over to Leo, and helped him into his jacket, my movements fluid and efficient. On the ferry ride home, the cold, damp, briny air felt like a relief, washing away the sterile perfume of Celeste's house. Leo, exhausted from playing, had fallen asleep in my arms, his small body a warm, trusting weight against my chest. The anger inside me wasn't hot anymore. It was a cold, hard knot in my gut, as cold as the deep, dark waters of the Puget Sound in winter. I stared out at the gray waves, and the face of Sergeant Frank Miller swam into my vision, his haunted, hollowed-out eyes in his last few months. His wife had done this to him, used his service, his scars, his PTSD, and twisted them into a weapon to take his kids and destroy his soul. And now, my own sister and her husband were running the same playbook on me. They didn't just want my son. They wanted to annihilate me, to prove I was broken, unfit, a monster. The lonely cry of the ferry's horn echoed across the water. I held Leo tighter, a silent promise forming in the deepest part of my being. No, not again. Not another soldier falls on home soil. I knew, in that moment, that this wasn't just my fight anymore. I was fighting for Frank. I was fighting for every person who has ever been cornered by their own family, been told their deepest sacrifices made them unworthy, been made to feel like a stranger in their own life. If you're listening to this, if you've ever felt that chill of betrayal from the one person who was supposed to keep you warm, then you know. You know I couldn't back down. "This battle, Frank," I whispered to his memory, "I will win for both of us." That night, after I tucked Leo into bed, reading him an extra chapter of his favorite book just to hear the steady sound of his breathing, I descended into the basement. This space was the antithesis of the rest of my meticulously organized home. It was my archive, my 20-year history in the U.S. Army packed into olive-drab footlockers and cardboard boxes. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, gun oil, and canvas. The smell of my other life. It was a space of ghosts, and tonight, I was ready to face them. I pulled a metal trunk out from under a dusty tarp and clicked open the latches. Inside lay the artifacts of my service, medals I rarely looked at, photographs of smiling faces in dusty fatigues, and nestled in a corner, a small, unassuming wooden box. I sat on the cold concrete floor, my back against a support beam. I reached into a small cooler I'd brought down and pulled out a bottle of Mac and Jack's African Amber, the same local craft beer Frank and I used to drink after a grueling week at Joint Base Lewis McChord. I twisted the cap off, the hiss echoing in the silence, but I didn't drink. I just held the cold, damp bottle, its familiar label a conduit to the past, and let the memories flood in. My mind wasn't on Bainbridge Island anymore. It was 6 months ago, at JBLM, in the sprawling, impersonal world of the base. I remembered Frank Miller. Not the hollowed-out shell he became, but the man he was. A burly Army sergeant with a booming laugh who could fix a Humvee with one hand and tell a joke that could make a drill sergeant crack a smile. But I also remembered the change, the slow, gut-wrenching erosion of that man. It started with the phone calls from his lawyer, each one chipping away another piece of his spirit. I remembered finding him in the mess hall, sitting alone, staring at his phone. He wasn't watching a game or texting his buddies. He was watching a video of himself. It was a clip, maybe 30 seconds long, skillfully edited from what must have been hours of body cam footage from a tense patrol. It showed him yelling, his face contorted in a mask of stress and fear. His ex-wife's lawyer had presented it in court as irrefutable proof of uncontrolled PTSD. They had taken a soldier's reaction in a high-stress environment and rebranded it as the rage of a monster. I had tried to help. I wrote a letter to the court, a sworn declaration detailing his exemplary service record, his character, his gentle nature with his own daughter, Lily. But my words, the words of a major who had served with him for years, were dismissed by the court as the biased testimony of a loyal colleague. The system had decided who he was, and the truth didn't matter. With a heavy sigh, I set the unopened beer aside and reached for the small wooden box. I lifted the lid. Inside, on a bed of worn velvet, was a single, folded letter. Frank had mailed it to me from a small, forgotten town in Oregon a few days before he took his own life. The handwriting was a frantic scrawl, the pen digging into the cheap, lined paper. I didn't need to read it to remember the words. They were burned into my memory. But tonight, I needed to feel them again. I needed the pain to fuel the cold fire that had started on the ferry. His words clawed at me from the page. He wrote about his daughter Lily and the last time he'd seen her. He wrote about the fear he saw in her eyes, a fear that had been planted there by her mother. "They turned my love for her into a weapon against me, Trudy," the letter read. "They told the court I loved her in an obsessive, unhealthy way, that my protective instincts were a symptom of my condition. Now I'm even afraid to hug her. I'm afraid she'll flinch. They told my little girl her daddy is a monster, Trudy. And she believed them. They won. They took my soul." A wave of impotent rage, the same rage I'd felt 6 months ago, washed over me, but this time it was different. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was recognition. A chilling, horrifying clarity. This was their playbook. Celeste and Leland weren't creative geniuses. They were scavengers, using a proven, deadly formula they had likely learned from the same dark corners of the legal world that had produced Frank's ex-wife's lawyer. What they did to Frank, they were now doing to me. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a copy. I carefully folded the letter, my hands steady now, and placed it back in its box. My gaze drifted to the corner of the basement, to a display case on a shelf. Inside, folded into a perfect, tight triangle, was the American flag that had draped Frank Miller's coffin. The flag they'd presented to his parents because his ex-wife hadn't wanted it. I walked over and placed my palm flat against the cold glass, my reflection a pale, determined specter superimposed over the stars and stripes. The soldier's creed, leave no man behind. It wasn't just a promise for the battlefield. It was a vow that extended beyond the wire, beyond the uniform. It was for the soldiers who made it home, only to find themselves fighting a new war, a quieter, more insidious one. It was for the fallen. "This time is different, Frank," I whispered, my voice a raw breath in the silent basement. "This time, the monster is going to lose." That flag was no longer just a memorial to a fallen friend. It was my battle standard. The fight for my son had just become a crusade for a brother in arms, and I would not fail. The next morning, I tried to build a fortress of normalcy for Leo. The air in our small kitchen filled with the comforting scent of buttermilk pancakes, a Sunday morning ritual I refused to surrender. I poured authentic Vermont maple syrup into a small pitcher, its amber sweetness a stark contrast to the bitter taste in my mouth. Leo, sitting at the kitchen island in his pajamas, chattered excitedly. He was talking about the new gift from his nice Aunt Celeste, a spaceship nightlight. "It has a little red eye, Mom," he said, his eyes wide with 8-year-old wonder. "Just like a real spaceship from the movies." His innocent words hit me like a physical blow. A cold dread washed over me, a familiar sensation from my years in intelligence. It was the feeling of noticing a detail that was just wrong. An unscheduled delivery. A car parked in the same spot for 3 days straight. In this case, it was the uncharacteristic generosity of my sister. Celeste didn't give gifts without an agenda. This spaceship wasn't a present, it was a Trojan horse. Every instinct I had honed over 20 years screamed that this was a red flag, flapping violently in the quiet morning air of my kitchen. The moment the school bus pulled away from our gravel driveway, the fortress of normalcy crumbled. I walked back into the house, my steps heavy, and went straight to Leo's room. The spaceship sat on his nightstand, a cheerful piece of plastic in a room filled with Lego creations and drawings of dinosaurs. I picked it up. It felt a fraction of an ounce too heavy, a detail no civilian would ever notice. But to a hand trained to detect hidden compartments, it was a dead giveaway. My heart pounded against my ribs as I carried it to my workbench in the garage. With the same precision toolkit I used to maintain my service weapon, I carefully pried open the plastic casing along a nearly invisible seam. And there it was. My breath caught in my throat. A wave of pure, unadulterated revulsion rose from my stomach. Tucked neatly beside the battery compartment was a micro camera. Its tiny lens aimed to have a perfect, unobstructed view of my son's bed. Next to it, a small, unfamiliar chip was wired to the speaker. They weren't just watching me, they were watching my son. They had invaded his sanctuary. This act was more profoundly violating than any insult, any lie. It was a desecration of the most sacred space I knew, my child's safety. This wasn't a family squabble anymore. This was monstrous. The initial shock was quickly replaced by an ice-cold fury. My training took over, pushing the emotional response aside and bringing analytical clarity to the forefront. I knew, with absolute certainty, that this wouldn't be the only device. This was part of a system. I retrieved my professional-grade RF signal scanner from the bottom of my old footlocker, a piece of counter-surveillance gear I'd kept, telling myself it was for peace of mind. I'd never imagined I'd be using it against my own family. Starting in the kitchen, I began a systematic sweep, just as I had been trained to do in safe houses and embassies abroad. The scanner was silent at first, then it emitted a soft beep, growing louder as I moved it closer to the Keurig coffee machine. Taped to the underside of the water reservoir was a tiny microphone, perfectly positioned to capture every conversation in the heart of our home. My stomach turned. I continued. Another alert, this time from the living room bookshelf. Tucked behind a hardcover copy of a Tom Clancy novel, the irony was sickening, was a small GPS tracker. They wanted to know my every move. The final discovery was the one that truly broke me. I went into my own bedroom, my personal space, and swept the ceiling. Above my bed, the scanner screamed. I got a stepladder, my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and violation. I popped the cover off the smoke detector, and there, nestled beside the 9-volt battery, was a high-resolution night vision camera. They had been watching me sleep. They had turned my home, my refuge from the world, into a glass prison. I carefully reassembled everything, placing each device back exactly where I had found it, my movements deft and silent. I sat on the floor of my living room, the quiet house now feeling sinister, every shadow a potential hiding place, every object a possible betrayal. The 5 small evil devices I had found were laid out in my mind like pieces on a chessboard. But I didn't remove them. I didn't smash them. A cardinal rule of counterintelligence, one that was now seared into my soul. Never let your enemy know you've found their surveillance, not until you're ready to use it against them. This discovery changed everything. They weren't just trying to paint me as an unstable mother. They were building a case, brick by insidious brick, using my own life as the raw material. My grief for Frank curdled into a new, terrifying understanding. This wasn't just a copy of the playbook that destroyed him, it was an upgraded version. I realized with a jolt that the strange chip in the nightlight was likely an ultrasonic emitter, designed to emit a low-frequency sound to disrupt Leo's sleep, to make him irritable and prone to outbursts, to create evidence of behavioral problems. I stood up, the cold resolve of a commander formulating a battle plan settling over me. They wanted to watch a show. They wanted to see the unstable veteran, the broken mother, fall apart under pressure. I walked to the window and stared out across the water toward the distant, gleaming towers of Seattle, where my sister and her husband were likely congratulating themselves. "All right, Celeste. Leland," I whispered to the empty room. "You want a show? I'll give you a performance you'll never forget." The hunter had just realized she was the prey, and now she was going to turn the tables. Living in my own glass prison was a unique form of psychological torture. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of a light sent a jolt of paranoia through me. I was constantly aware of the unseen eyes, the silent ears. The performance was exhausting. I smiled when I wanted to scream, I hummed when I wanted to curse. After a few days of this, the walls felt like they were physically closing in. I needed to breathe. I needed a space where I wasn't a target. I needed to get out. So, I drove. I took the bridge over Agate Pass and headed north to Polsbu, a small town on Liberty Bay known for its Scandinavian charm and fiercely independent spirit. My destination was a small, unassuming coffee shop called Valhalla Coffee. The place smelled of dark roast beans and fresh-baked pastries, a comforting aroma that was the polar opposite of my sister's suffocating perfume. Valhalla was an unofficial sanctuary, a weekly meeting spot for a handful of local veterans. We never called it a support group. It was just coffee. The owner, a burly former Marine with a Viking-esque beard, saw me walk in. He gave me a single, solid nod of greeting, already turning to pull a shot for the Americano he knew I always ordered. I took the warm ceramic mug and slid into a worn wooden booth. Across from me sat two familiar faces, a retired Navy pilot named Dave and a retired Army nurse named Martha. She must have been in her late 70s, with kind eyes that had seen more than any of us. There were no probing questions, no suffocating sympathy. We talked about the things normal people talk about: the ridiculous price of gas, the chances of the Seattle Seahawks making the playoffs this year, the best way to fix a leaky roof. They didn't need to know the details of my war. They had fought their own. Their presence alone was a quiet affirmation that echoed louder than any words. We are here. You are not alone. This was my chosen family, the one forged not by blood, but by shared scars. In the middle of Dave's rant about a bad call in last Sunday's game, the words just tumbled out of my mouth, quiet and unbidden. They think I'm a bad mother. I didn't say who they were. I didn't have to. The men fell silent, looking down at their coffee mugs, giving me the space I needed. But Martha, she reached across the table and placed her warm, wrinkled hand over mine. Her touch was firm, grounding. She had spent her life tending to the broken bodies and spirits of soldiers, and her touch carried the weight of that experience. "Honey," she said, her voice a low, steady balm. "A mother's love isn't measured in perfect meals or a spotless house. It's measured in the sleepless nights you spend by their bedside when they're sick. It's measured in the strength you find to fight the whole damn world for them. Don't you ever let anyone tell you otherwise." And with that, the dam I had so carefully constructed inside me broke. A single, hot tear, the first one I'd allowed myself to shed since this whole nightmare began, escaped and rolled down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of weakness. It was a tear of gratitude, of being seen. A therapist at the VA once quoted Brené Brown to me. "Vulnerability is not weakness. It's our greatest measure of courage." In that moment, surrounded by my chosen family, I understood. Allowing myself this moment of vulnerability was an act of defiance. It was in that fragile, precious moment of peace that my phone buzzed on the table, a harsh, electronic intrusion. The caller ID read, "Leo Marks Elementary." My blood ran cold. I answered. "This is Trudy Marks." The voice on the other end belonged to the principal, Mrs. Davison. Her tone was formal, detached, and chillingly professional. "Ms. Marks, I'm calling because I need to schedule a meeting with you. There have been some concerns raised by other parents." She paused, and I could hear the rustling of papers. "And we've also received a formal report from a member of your family. We need to discuss Leo's home environment." A formal report from a family member. The warm, safe world of the coffee shop evaporated. The floor fell out from under me. The net wasn't just inside my house anymore. They had cast it wider. They had reached into my son's school, into the community, turning the very systems designed to protect children into weapons against me. This was a full-scale assault, and I had been walking right into it. I see," I managed to say, my own voice sounding distant. "When would you like to meet?" We set a time for the next day. I hung up, my hand trembling so badly I almost dropped the phone. Dave and Martha were looking at me, their earlier casualness replaced by a familiar, grave understanding. They knew that look. They'd seen it on the faces of countless soldiers who had just received bad news from home. It was the look of someone realizing the enemy was no longer on the horizon, but had already breached the perimeter. My secret war was over. It was now public. "They've started," I said, my voice a hoarse whisper. The air felt thick, heavy. "The storm is here." Martha's hand tightened on mine. "Then we'll face it together," she said, her voice fierce. I was grateful for her strength, for their silent solidarity. But as I looked out the window at the gray, unforgiving sky, I knew the truth. This was my storm. And I was standing right at its heart, alone. The principal's call was a declaration of war on a new front. The battle was no longer confined to my home. It had spilled into the public sphere, targeting my reputation and my son's well-being. I couldn't just play defense anymore. I had to go on the offensive, and that meant identifying the enemy's command structure. All roads led to one place, my brother-in-law's law firm, Vance and Albright. Playing the part of a victim wouldn't work. I needed to infiltrate, not plead. So, I became someone else. I created a new identity. Sarah Jenkins, a well-funded tech entrepreneur from out of state, looking for aggressive legal counsel on a complex corporate merger. I booked a consultation, and as part of my cover, I specifically requested a junior associate, framing it as a desire for a fresh, hungry perspective. I was hoping for someone not yet corrupted by the firm's culture. They assigned me to a young lawyer named Maya Flores. The Vance and Albright offices occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming skyscraper in downtown Seattle. Stepping out of the elevator was like entering another world. Polished marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows with panoramic views of Elliott Bay, and the hushed, expensive silence of money and power. My heart hammered against my ribs. I was walking into the lion's den, armed with nothing but a lie. Maya Flores was sharp, intelligent, and impeccably dressed, but there was a weariness in her eyes that didn't match her age. As I laid out my fabricated case, I strategically seeded the conversation with keywords from my own situation. I spoke of a hostile takeover, of a vicious smear campaign by a competitor, of fabricated evidence and a bitter family dispute tangled up in the business deal. With each keyword, I saw a flicker of recognition. A shadow of discomfort crossed Maya's face. She knew. She wasn't just hearing a hypothetical case, she was hearing an echo of something ugly within her own firm. As our meeting concluded, I knew I had my opening. When she walked me to the reception area, our professional distance momentarily closed. As we shook hands, she pressed a small, cold object into my palm. It was a USB flash drive. "Parking garage, level P2. 10 minutes," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the hallway. "Don't let anyone see you." Then she turned, her professional mask back in place, and walked away. The 10-minute wait in the sterile, silent reception area was one of the longest of my life. I finally took the elevator down to the concrete chill of the parking garage. The smell of exhaust fumes and damp concrete hung heavy in the air. Maya emerged from behind a concrete pillar, looking pale and frightened. She pushed a second USB drive into my hand. "I can't be a part of this anymore," she said, her voice trembling. They did this to another soldier. A custody battle. He's dead." My heart stopped. Frank. The name was a silent scream in my mind. It was all connected. My worst fears were confirmed. I looked at this brave, terrified young woman. "Thank you," was all I could manage to say. That night, after Leo was asleep, I took my old non-networked laptop, my air-gapped computer from my army days, and plugged in the USB drive. The contents loaded, and a wave of nausea washed over me. It was a single, password-protected folder. The password Maya had given me was one word: Frank. Inside was the entire monstrous architecture of my own destruction. It had a name, a sickeningly ironic one: Project Nightingale. It was all there. A labyrinth of emails, memos, psychological profiles, and financial records. They had a file on me, referring to me only as the subject. They had analyzed my service record, my psych evaluations, everything. A memo from Leland to a man I'd never heard of, Sterling Croft, detailed my weaknesses, my loyalty to my men, my fierce, protective love for my son. They weren't just attacking me, they were dissecting me, turning my best qualities into pathologies. Another document, authored by Croft, outlined a series of behavioral triggers designed to provoke negative reactions. Celeste's snide remarks about my MREs, the unannounced visits, the constant questioning of my fitness as a mother, it was all scripted. Every move was a calculated play. They had even weaponized my very nature. The subject has a caregiver's disposition, one chilling entry read. We will leverage this instinct, framing her protective actions as obsessive control. The file contained a detailed schematic of my house, with the locations of all 5 listening devices and cameras marked with red X's. They had planned the invasion of my home with the cold precision of a military operation. And Sterling Croft's name was everywhere, the puppet master pulling the strings, with Celeste and Leland as his willing marionettes. My war now had a face. This wasn't just about my sister's jealousy or my brother-in-law's greed. This was about dismantling a corrupt and deadly machine. I felt like I was walking through the valley of the shadow of death, just like the psalm says. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Fear was a luxury I couldn't afford. The USB drive in my hand wasn't just a collection of files. It was a weapon. It was the complete operational blueprint of my enemy. They had given me a map to their entire operation. The question now was, how do I burn it to the ground? Armed with Project Nightingale, I transitioned from defense to offense. The time for reacting was over. My home was no longer just a sanctuary to be protected. It was now a strategic outpost. The enemy had handed me their playbook, and now I was going to use it to write the ending. My first move was a classic psychological warfare tactic, one designed to fracture the enemy's command and control. Sow dissent in the ranks. I knew the microphone nestled under my Keurig was their primary listening post. So, it was time to put on a show. I staged a phone call with Dave, the retired Navy pilot. Pacing in my kitchen, my movements natural but with an undercurrent of agitation, I spoke in a voice just loud enough to be clearly captured. I can't believe it, Dave, I said, infusing my voice with calculated excitement. This new lawyer is a miracle worker. He's found a source. From inside the firm. I paused, letting the silence hang before delivering the payload. He says he has documentation on Croft's entire plan. Something about financial misconduct. He says we have enough to blow this whole thing wide open. I was planting a virus of paranoia, designed to make them look at each other, to wonder who the leak was. It worked faster than I expected. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I knew by heart, but had deleted. Celeste. We need to talk. Just the two of us. The bait had been taken. The panic was setting in. I refused to meet on her turf. No more sterile mansions or power lunches. I chose the location. A gritty, old-school diner near the Bremerton Ferry Terminal. A place with cracked vinyl booths and the lingering smell of fried bacon. A place where her designer handbag would look comically out of place. It was neutral ground, but it felt like my ground. I was already in a back booth, nursing a black coffee, when she walked in. She looked around, her discomfort obvious, before spotting me. As she slid into the seat opposite me, her face was a mask of practiced sorrow. The performance began immediately. Her eyes welled up with perfectly timed tears. "Oh, Trudy," she began, her voice thick with fake emotion. "I'm so sorry. Leland. He pushed me into it. He can be so persuasive. I was just so terribly worried about Leo." I said nothing. I just sat there, my hands wrapped around the warm mug, and held her gaze. I let the silence stretch, a vast, uncomfortable chasm between us. In my experience, if you give a liar enough silence, they will eventually hang themselves with it. My quiet stare was a more powerful weapon than any accusation. It told her I wasn't buying it. Seeing the waterworks had failed, she shifted tactics. She leaned forward, trying to conjure the ghost of a bond we once shared. Trudy, remember that time in middle school? When those older boys were teasing me by the bleachers, and you came out of nowhere and pushed the biggest one right into the mud. You've always been my protector. You've always looked out for me. The words were a poisoned dart, dipped in the sweet honey of nostalgia. She was weaponizing our childhood, twisting an act of sisterly love into a tool for manipulation. For a fleeting second, a flicker of the sister I once knew, the one I had protected, made me hesitate. A painful, familiar hope whispered in my ear. What if she really is sorry? It was a moment of weakness, a brief, treacherous thought that I had to consciously extinguish. A VA therapist once told me, "You can't change other people, you can only change your reaction to them." My reaction now was clarity. I let her finish, let her spin her web of half-truths. Then, without a word, I reached into my bag and slid a single sheet of paper across the sticky tabletop. It was a printout of an email from the USB drive, an email from Celeste to Sterling Croft. The subject line was stark and clinical. Trigger tactics for T. T for Trudy. Her eyes scanned the page. I watched the blood drain from her face as she read her own words, her own suggestions for how to best exploit my trauma. She had been the one to suggest using the memory of Frank Miller to provoke a reaction, calling it my primary emotional weak point. Every lie, every carefully constructed facade, crumbled into dust right there in that greasy spoon diner. Her performance was over. "You're not worried about Leo," I said, my voice low and steady, each word a carefully placed stone. "You're not sorry. You're just sorry you got caught." I leaned forward slightly, my eyes locking onto hers. This was never about Leland, and it was never about concern. It's about envy. It has always been about envy, Celeste. Of my uniform, of my independence, of the fact that I built a life for myself that didn't depend on a rich husband to pay for it. And so, you decided to try and take the one thing that truly matters to me. I stood up, my movements calm and deliberate. I put a $10 bill on the table to cover my coffee. This conversation is over. The next time we see each other, it will be in front of a judge. I looked down at her, at the woman who was my sister in name only, her perfect face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. "And Celeste," I added, my voice dropping to a near whisper, cold and final as a tombstone. "Tell Leland and tell Sterling Croft. This soldier is not retreating. This soldier is just getting started." I turned and walked out of the diner without looking back, leaving her there, a ghost of our shared past, shipwrecked in a sea of her own deceit. The broken mirror of our sisterhood could never be put back together, and I was finally, blessedly, done trying to pick up the pieces. My meeting with Celeste had solidified one thing. There was no reasoning with them. There was only victory or defeat. To win, I needed a kill shot. A piece of evidence so undeniable, it would vaporize their entire narrative and expose them for the predators they were. The documents from Maya were the battle plan, but I needed to catch the general in the act. The opportunity presented itself in the glossy society pages of the Seattle Times. Celeste and Leland were co-chairing the annual Children's Shield Charity Gala, a high-profile event for the city's wealthiest patrons. And according to the file Maya gave me, their special consultant, Sterling Croft, would be an honored guest. It was the perfect stage, a battlefield disguised in silk and champagne. I wasn't going to the gala as Trudy Marks, the grieving, unstable mother they were trying to create. I was going as Major Marks, on a reconnaissance mission. My preparation was entirely tactical. I selected my uniform with precision. Not a glittering gown that would draw attention, but a simple, elegant black dress. The kind of sophisticated attire that allows you to blend into the background, to become part of the scenery, easily mistaken for an event coordinator or a high-level assistant. My equipment was minimal but effective. A high-end smartphone with a superior low-light camera and a pen in my small clutch that was also a high-fidelity audio recorder. I wasn't going to a party. I was going hunting. The Chihuly Garden and Glass Museum, nestled at the base of the Space Needle, was transformed into a glittering wonderland. Ethereal glass sculptures in vibrant blues, reds, and yellows twisted towards the ceiling, bathed in dramatic spotlights that made them feel alive. The air hummed with the sound of a live, smooth jazz trio, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the low, self-important murmur of Seattle's elite. I moved through the crowd, a ghost in black, my senses on high alert, cataloging exits, observing security, and tracking my targets. I spotted them immediately. The unholy trinity. Celeste was holding court near a towering, flame-colored sculpture, radiant in a silver dress, her laughter echoing a little too loudly, a little too forced. Leland stood beside her, a smug, proprietary look on his face as he shook hands with a state senator. And with them, a man I knew instantly was Sterling Croft. He was handsome in a cold, reptilian way, his tailored suit fitting him perfectly, but his eyes were flat and predatory. They moved through the room like royalty, accepting accolades for their supposed generosity, the very picture of civic-minded philanthropy. Then came the speeches. Celeste took the stage, standing before a large banner that read, "The Children's Shield." A wave of physical nausea rolled through me as I listened to her speak with breathless sincerity about protecting the innocent, about shielding fragile young souls from unstable and damaging home environments. She was using the very real pain of abused and neglected children as a shield for her own monstrous actions, using charity as a weapon to burnish the public image she would use to steal my son. It was the most profound, sickening hypocrisy I had ever witnessed. I gripped the recording pen in my clutch, the cool, hard metal a small anchor in a sea of silent rage. I knew a man like Croft, arrogant and obsessive, a micromanager of deceit, wouldn't be able to resist checking on his prize project. My job was to be patient, to observe his patterns, and to anticipate his next move. I watched him circulate, watched him schmooze, his smile never quite reaching his cold eyes. Then, it happened. I saw him discreetly check his phone, a flicker of irritation crossing his smooth features. He excused himself from a conversation with a polite murmur and moved purposefully toward a hallway marked "Staff Only." This was it. The moment. I followed, keeping a safe distance, using the large, colorful glass installations and the milling crowds as cover. He glanced over his shoulder once, a reflexive, paranoid gesture, but his eyes swept right past me. I was just another woman in a black dress, invisible. He slipped into a small administrative office, leaving the door slightly ajar, not quite latched. My heart began to pound a heavy rhythmic drum against my ribs, but my training kept my breathing even, my hands steady. I crept closer, my heels silent on the polished concrete floor until I was just outside the door, shrouded in the shadow of a massive blue glass chandelier. I peered through the narrow gap, and my blood ran cold. There he was. Sterling Croft, bathed in the pale blue glow of a laptop screen. And on that screen, unmistakable and sickeningly clear, was a live feed from the night vision camera in my bedroom. He was watching me, or rather, he was watching an empty room, waiting for me to appear. He was checking his traps. At a gala meant to protect children from predators, he was actively engaged in being one, indulging in the illegal surveillance of a mother in the sanctity of her own home. The adrenaline hit me, sharp and clean as breaking glass. This was the shot. This was the smoking gun. My hands were rock solid as I raised my phone. Through the narrow crack in the door, I angled the camera. The low light was a challenge, but the phone's sensor was exceptional. I didn't use the flash. I took a burst of photos, the nearly silent clicks of the digital shutter masked by the distant, mellow notes of the jazz trio. The images were clear, damning, and irrefutable. Sterling Croft, the celebrated consultant, his face illuminated by the illegal surveillance footage of my home. I had it. The proof. The bullet for my gun. And in that moment, I felt a connection to all of you who are listening. To anyone who has ever felt powerless, who has ever been the sole keeper of a terrible truth, desperately searching for that one single piece of evidence that would make the world believe you. This is that moment. This is the moment the tables begin to turn. I slowly, silently, backed away, melting back into the shadows of the hallway and then into the oblivious, glittering crowd. A wave of triumphant ice-cold adrenaline surged through me. It was the pure, clean feeling of a successful mission. I had my weapon. I had the final, undeniable piece of the puzzle. The next chapter would not be about hunting. It would be about firing the shot. The night before the hearing, I didn't sleep. It wasn't anxiety. It was the calm focus of a soldier before dawn, the quiet hum of readiness. My lawyer, Marcus Thorne, a sharp, no-nonsense man Maya had recommended, had the full arsenal. We weren't just going to defend, we were going to attack. But not in the courtroom. Not at first. We were going to hit them where they lived, in the court of public opinion. Working through the night, Marcus's team packaged the entire Project Nightingale file, the emails, the psych profiles, the damning photo of Croft at the gala, into a secure, anonymous digital drop. The recipient was a Pulitzer-nominated investigative reporter at the Seattle Times, a woman known for taking down corporate giants. We knew that Leland and Celeste valued their public image above all else. We were about to incinerate it. As I sat in the sterile waiting area of the King County Superior Court the next morning, my phone began to buzz. Then, Marcus's phone buzzed. A news alert. The digital front page of the Seattle Times was live. The headline was a cannon blast. Project Nightingale. When a top-tier law firm weaponizes family trauma. The article was a meticulous, brutal takedown, detailing the conspiracy, naming Vance and Albright, and featuring the grainy but undeniable photo of Sterling Croft viewing the illegal surveillance feed. The story was spreading like wildfire across social media. The first shot had been fired, and it was a direct hit. Moments later, Celeste and Leland swept into the courthouse, radiating an aura of untouchable confidence. Celeste was dressed in a pristine cream-colored suit, the picture of a concerned, respectable matriarch. Leland walked with the arrogant swagger of a man who believed he owned the world. They were completely oblivious to the digital inferno that was already consuming their reputations. They smiled thinly at me, a look of pity and condescension, and took their places at the opposing table. Their lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit, stood up and began his opening remarks. He painted a picture of me as a highly decorated but deeply troubled veteran, whose untreated PTSD posed a significant risk to my own son. I sat perfectly still, listening to the web of lies, my expression unreadable. Then Marcus Thorne stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He simply walked to the judge's bench. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "before we proceed, I believe this is relevant to the case at hand." He placed a freshly printed copy of the Seattle Times article on the bench. The judge, a stern, experienced woman named Judge Albright, picked it up. Her eyes scanned the headline, then the first few paragraphs. I saw her jaw tighten. A deep frown etched itself onto her face. She looked up, her gaze like ice, and fixed it on Leland. "Counselor Vance," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "I believe we have far more serious matters to discuss today than the plaintiff's parenting style." Leland, looking confused, was handed a copy by his own stunned associate. I watched as his face went through a rapid, satisfying series of transformations, from arrogant confidence to confusion to dawning horror, and finally to ashen, wide-eyed panic. He looked at the photo of Croft, then at me. Celeste, seeing the look on her husband's face, began to tremble, her carefully constructed composure shattering like cheap glass. The momentum had shifted. The ground had given way beneath their feet. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Marcus continued, his voice resonating with authority, "since my client's character as a mother has been so viciously attacked based on video evidence, we would like to present the full, unedited versions of those videos to the court." On the large screen in the courtroom, our evidence began to play. First, the clip of me saying, "When things settle down." But in the full version, the camera panned to show the section of our backyard fence that had been damaged in a recent windstorm. My full sentence was, "We'll have your friends over when things settle down, honey, right after I get this fence fixed so the dog doesn't get out." Next came the proof of Leo's supposed behavioral issues. The unedited footage showed a happy, energetic boy. But then Marcus's audio expert isolated a high-frequency, barely audible sound emanating from the spaceship nightlight. He explained to the court how such frequencies are used to cause agitation and sleep disruption. The room was silent, the implication hanging heavy and poisonous in the air. The final video was from my own bedroom camera, time-stamped at 2 a.m. It showed me entering Leo's room, not in a rage, but on tiptoe. It showed me gently pulling his blanket back over his shoulders, stroking his hair, and humming a soft lullaby before quietly slipping out. It was a simple, tender moment of motherhood. The very thing they had tried to twist into something monstrous. It was the truth, and it was devastating. Their entire case, their entire narrative, had been systematically dismantled and destroyed using their own weapons. It was a complete and utter rout. Judge Albright looked at Celeste and Leland with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "This court," she declared, her voice ringing with finality, "finds these proceedings to be a malicious and fraudulent abuse of the justice system. The plaintiff's petition is dismissed with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, I am ordering a full investigation into the firm of Vance and Albright and a Mr. Sterling Croft for illegal surveillance, conspiracy, and perjury." Celeste let out a strangled sob, but it wasn't the sound of remorse. It was the sound of a narcissist whose perfect image had been publicly shattered. Leland, ever the survivor, didn't even look at her. He gathered his papers, his face a pale, sweaty mask, and practically fled the courtroom, leaving his wife to collapse in a heap of designer fabric and ruined ambition. I didn't feel a surge of gleeful triumph. I just felt quiet. A profound, bone-deep sense of relief washed over me, as if a 200-pound rucksack I'd been carrying for months had finally been lifted from my shoulders. The battle was over. I nodded once to Marcus, a silent, grateful acknowledgement of his work, and then I walked out of the courtroom, leaving the smoldering wreckage of their lives behind me. The war was won. The days following the court hearing were strangely quiet. My house, once a prison of unseen eyes, now felt vast and silent. The news was a firestorm. Vance and Albright was imploding under the weight of lawsuits and an ethics investigation. Sterling Croft had apparently vanished, his reputation and career vaporized overnight. And Leland, in a final act of self-preservation, had filed for divorce from Celeste, publicly cutting ties to save what little he could of his own skin. I saw the headlines on my phone's news feed, but I didn't click on them. I had no interest in watching the carrion birds pick at the corpses of their lives. There was no sense of elation, no victory parade in my soul. There was only a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The adrenaline that had sustained me for weeks had drained away, leaving a hollow ache in its place. The victory didn't taste sweet. It tasted of ash and loss. I'd won the war for my son, for my dignity, for Frank's memory. But in the process, I had lost my sister, or rather, I'd finally been forced to admit that the sister I once knew had been gone for a very long time. A few days later, a letter arrived. It wasn't a bill or junk mail. It was a handwritten card, the kind people rarely send anymore. It was from Maya Flores. She wrote that she had resigned from Vance and Albright the day after the hearing. She had accepted a position with a nonprofit organization that provides free legal aid to veterans. "You showed me what real courage looks like," she wrote in her neat, precise script. "Thank you for helping me find my own moral compass again." I held the card to my chest, a small warm ember in the cold aftermath of the battle. My fight had, in some small way, helped someone else find their own. Then came the email. It was from Celeste. The subject line was just my name, Trudy. The tone was completely different from any of her previous communications. The arrogance, the manipulation, the condescension, all gone. It was replaced by a raw, pathetic desperation. She wrote about Leland abandoning her, about her friends refusing her calls, about her perfect world collapsing around her. She begged me to forgive her, to help her, to remember that we're sisters. I read the email twice. A final bitter wave of anger rose in me. There was no remorse in her words, not for what she had done to me, not for what she had tried to do to Leo. Her sorrow was entirely for herself, for the consequences she now faced. She wasn't sorry she had tried to burn my life to the ground. She was just sorry she had gotten caught holding the matches. Forgiveness, I realized, cannot be granted when it is not truly sought. It cannot be a cheap bandage for a self-inflicted wound. I didn't reply. Instead, I began a ritual, my own quiet ceremony of severance. I started in Leo's room. I took the spaceship nightlight from his bedside table, its cheerful plastic shell now a symbol of profound betrayal. I went to the kitchen and untaped the microphone from beneath the Keurig. I retrieved the GPS tracker from behind the Tom Clancy novel. And finally, I stood on the stepladder in my bedroom and removed the night vision camera from the smoke detector. I gathered the 5 small, sinister devices on my kitchen table. I didn't smash them with a hammer. I didn't throw them against the wall. That would have been an act of rage. This was an act of peace. With my precision toolkit, I calmly and methodically dismantled each one, piece by tiny piece, neutralizing them, stripping them of their power and their malicious purpose, and reducing them to a harmless pile of plastic and wires. Then I went outside into the damp, cool air of my backyard. I had a small metal burn barrel I used for yard waste. Into it, I placed the final, crumpled letter from Frank. On top of it, I placed a printed copy of Celeste's desperate email. I struck a match. The flame caught the edge of the paper, and the words that had caused so much pain began to curl, blacken, and turn to ash. As the smoke drifted up into the gray Pacific Northwest sky, I felt the heavy weight of the past begin to lift, molecule by molecule. There is a philosophy among some of the Native American tribes of this region, a deep respect for the natural cycles of life, death, and rebirth. They understand that some things must die for new things to grow. Standing there, watching the last embers glow, I accepted it. The relationship with my sister was dead. It had been for years. I had just been refusing to sign the death certificate. I walked back inside. I picked up my phone, my fingers steady. I found Celeste's contact information and held my thumb over the delete button. This wasn't an act of hatred. It was an act of healing. It was the final necessary step in building a firewall to protect my future, and Leo's. I pressed the button. Then I did the same for Leland. A profound sense of tranquility settled over me, a quiet I hadn't felt in months. The war was over. The ghosts had been put to rest. Now it was time to heal. 6 months passed. The chill of winter gave way to the gentle, persistent rain of a Pacific Northwest spring. The world outside my window began to come alive again, and with it, so did I. On a bright Saturday morning, I was in my garden, my knees covered in damp earth. Beside me, Leo was carefully planting a young rhododendron, the state flower of Washington, its waxy green leaves full of promise. The air was clean, smelling of wet soil and pine needles from the tall Douglas firs surrounding our property. I plunged my hands into the cool, dark soil, feeling its texture, its life. For the first time in almost a year, I felt truly present in my own home. I no longer scanned the corners of rooms for hidden lenses or flinched at the sound of the furnace kicking on. I had reclaimed this space. It was mine again. Leo let out a delighted squeal as a fat earthworm wriggled over his hand. His laughter, pure and unrestrained, echoed through the quiet yard. It was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. This piece wasn't a gift. It wasn't luck. It was a territory I had fought for, bled for, and won. The following weekend, I found myself driving back to Joint Base Lewis McChord. But I wasn't going as Major Marks, the intelligence officer. I was just Trudy, a volunteer. I sat in a standard sterile classroom, facing a group of young soldiers, men and women in their early 20s, their faces a mixture of excitement and raw apprehension about their upcoming transition back to civilian life. They were about to step onto a different kind of battlefield, one they were completely unprepared for. I told them my story. Not all of it, not the ugliest details, but enough. I told them about Frank. I didn't frame it as a tragedy, but as a lesson, a piece of critical intelligence for their next mission. The toughest battle you'll ever fight, I told them, my voice quiet but carrying to the back of the room, might not be overseas. Sometimes it's in your own living room. The most dangerous enemy might be someone you think you know best. Someone who knows exactly where to find the cracks in your armor. I looked around the room, meeting their young, earnest eyes. Prepare for it. Build your support network now. Your fire team, your chosen family. Don't try to fight it alone, because you are not alone. After the session, as I was packing my bag, a young female captain approached me. She was sharp, with intelligent eyes that held a familiar shadow of weariness. Ma'am, she said, correcting herself. Thank you. What you said, I'm in the middle of a custody battle myself. My ex-husband is using my deployment as a weapon against me. I was close to giving up. I looked at her, and in her face I saw a reflection of myself just a few short months ago, cornered, exhausted, and fighting for the one thing that mattered most. I gave her a small, genuine smile. You're not alone, Captain, I said, my voice soft. Here. I wrote my personal cell number on a slip of paper. This is my number. Call me anytime, day or night. We'll figure it out. She took the paper, her fingers closing around it as if it were a lifeline. In that moment, I understood. I had transformed my pain into a purpose. Frank's legacy wouldn't be one of despair. It would be the warning I could now offer, the strength I could now lend. The cycle of destruction had been broken, and in its place, a cycle of support had begun. That evening, I returned home. The sun was setting, painting the sky over the Puget Sound in breathtaking shades of orange and pink. The snow-capped peak of Mount Rainier in the distance was bathed in a rosy alpenglow. I sat on my back porch, a steaming mug of herbal tea warming my hands. Leo was racing across the lawn with a goofy golden retriever puppy we had just adopted from a local shelter, their joyous barks echoing in the twilight. I didn't know what the future held. The scar from my relationship with Celeste would likely never fade completely. There would always be a phantom ache where a sister used to be. But for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I wasn't afraid. I had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, faced the darkness in my own family, and emerged on the other side. I had fought for my own dawn. And as I watched my son, happy and safe, throwing a ball for his new best friend, I knew that this victory, this quiet, hard-won peace, was worth more than any medal I had ever earned. My story has found its peace, but I know that for many of you, your own battles are still being fought. Thank you for walking with me through the darkness and into the dawn. If my journey has resonated with you, I invite you to share your own strength in the comments below. Your story matters, and it could be the light that someone else needs to see. To hear more true stories of resilience and the fight for dignity, please consider following our channel. Together we can turn our individual scars into a collective shield. You are not alone.